We'll just leave it.
Good thing I wore a belt. It's on. It is on. Okay. It is on. It plugs in like separately.
Could it be a battery?
Okay, is this on? Am I using this because this isn't working? Okay. I'm gonna take this off then. So I don't have to worry about it when I'm doing whatever.
Testing. How far should I hold it?
Right there.
This.
Perfect.
Okay. I guess I'll start. Probably why you're here is the recognition of the fact that it's amazing that we get to talk about sex in church. Like, how many hours have we been talking about sex? I haven't heard too many penises and vaginas, but I will probably be saying it a lot. I've said it a lot already this morning. But to normalize the language, people. And with that, here's a sex therapy tip, something I recommend to people, is to help normalize the language, penis, vagina, talking about sex. Read a sex book out loud with your husband. And then after a paragraph or two, or a page, or a chapter, talk about it. Take turns. Because we need to get more comfortable with this language. Because sexual communication is imperative for a good sex life. That was free. I didn't have to. So yeah, we're talking about sex in a church without no preceding it, and not only in the context of wait until marriage. Because I don't know about you, I mean, you're here, so probably, but I haven't heard pastors talk about sex outside of our stance is wait until marriage, and then they move on. Literally heard that from the pulpit, like within the past year. And then moved on. And I was like, I want to hear more. Don't we all? So when those are the only messages of don't, no, and then wait until marriage, when those are the only messages that we're taught when we're young women, when we're youth, growing up as singles, what impact does that have on our sexuality? Well, that's why I'm here. That's why you're here. Because I'm sure it's impacted your sexuality if there hasn't been open communication. So we're going to be looking at this concept of sexual story. Some of you, if you've done a lot of personal work, you've read books, if you've been in therapy, like the idea of sexual story, may be not too uncommon for you. But some of you may be sitting here like, I've never heard those two words put together, what is that? So our sexual story is like, when you look back to growing up years, what messages did you get from, anything that was around you? So we're going to be looking at this concept of sexual story, and then why our sexual stories matter. So before we move on, okay, it's fine. On the previous slide, it had the words sex and shame. So we're going to define some terms before moving forward. So sex, or in the broader term of sexuality, essentially the way that I want you to start thinking about it is your sexuality is your comfortability in your skin, in your femininity. How do you feel about yourself as a woman, as a female? Do you have to hide your beauty, your God-given sexiness? Because we are sexy. But a lot of us believe that our sexiness is somehow a threat, and so we repress it. So sexuality is how comfortable you are in your skin as a woman, as a female created in God's image. And we can't fully embrace relationship if we aren't comfortable in our skin. Because we are walking around in it, and we bring ourselves to every interaction, to every relationship. And if you're not comfortable with yourself, then how can you be comfortable in a relationship? Because then on some level, we are living in shame. So that brings us to the definition of shame, which maybe a lot of you have been well versed in by now, because Brene Brown has made it pretty popular. But from Brene Brown's definition of what she's found in her research, the definition that I like to use is that shame is the fear that we are not worthy of love or relationship. Shame is the fear that we are not worthy of love or relationship. Yeah, okay. So I reference this verse a lot with my clients and when I am self-reflecting and looking at how I am living my life. It's the verse in 1 John. There is no fear in love, but perfect love drives out fear, because fear has to do with punishment. The one who fears is not made perfect in love. What I want for you ladies, my hope, my heart, why I do the work that I do, is that I want your sexual story to be made perfect in love. Because that's what I believe is God's heart. You know, as Ruth said last night, you know, he has come to bring life and help us live it to the full. And that includes our sexual lives. Are we living our sexual lives in its fullness? Is it freed from fear, from anxiety, from shame, which is the fear that you aren't worthy? So why focus on our sexual story? Because sex without shame or fear is how God intended it to be. You know, Genesis 2:25, Adam and Eve were naked and unashamed. When you are naked with your husband, are you unashamed? Are you completely free? Do you believe you are completely worthy of love? So when you look at those two word bubbles on the screen, which word best encapsulates your sexuality? Fear or love? Where do you live from? Because you may know in your left brain that you are worthy, you know, that it's meant to be a loving experience, an encounter with your husband. But what is the fruit that you are seeing in your sexual relationship? With how you carry yourself as a woman, with what you believe about yourself. You know, I wouldn't doubt it if most, if not all of you are here because shame and fear plagues your sexual relationship with your husband, or if you're single, you know, your sexuality and what you believe about yourself as a sexual being. Because shame and fear inhibit us from experiencing the love God has for us. The love God longs for us to experience in our sexual relationship with our husband. If fear is not driven out by perfect love, if we have shame, if we don't believe we are worthy of being loved as females and being in loving, kind sexual relationships, how does that impact your marriage? How does that impact engage sexually. Because if fear drives your sexual story more than love, more than God's original intent, you likely have some sexual problem. You don't have sex as often as is good, as your husband would like, as you ultimately know is good for your marriage. And so we're going to be looking at those impacts. But first, let's delve more into getting you guys to think about your sexual story. Because if you are walking around in shame on any level when it comes to sex or your sexuality or God-given femininity, that shame comes from somewhere. Your struggle in your sexual relationship with your husband has roots. And it has roots in your family of origin. It could be from purity culture, from church messages, from the media, from culture, society. And because our brains understand through story, if we don't have the language for our story, if we don't have the language for why it is that we are struggling, like what it is that inhibits us, that causes anxieties, the anxieties that tighten our pelvic floor muscles that lead to sexual pain. If we don't have that language, then we won't be able to fully understand, and without understanding, there isn't healing, at least on the deep level that is long-lasting. The enemy's only weapon is deception, and he wants to keep you in the dark. He doesn't want me to share the stuff that I'm sharing today, that I will be sharing in the coming slides. Because I'm revealing the words that we carry on a very deep level. Some of you are already aware. I mean, these teachings that I'll be sharing, these messages that I know a lot of us, if not all of us, carry on some level. You guys know them, but when you start to link it to your sexual story and your sexual struggle, then you can start to address it from a more purposeful level. So what language would you put to your sexual story? And what if those words that make up your sexual story aren't the truth with a capital T? So in order to see that we may be holding on to inaccurate teachings, we have to first put language to our stories that we believe in our hearts and our minds, the stories that impact our vaginal muscles, our sexual desire, and our feelings of disconnect with our husband. So an exercise I have all my sex therapy clients do, which I'm going to share with you today, is an exercise that I had to do my very first class in the sex therapy program, and it was called a sexual autobiography. And when I would do it with clients, I call it their sexual timeline. So something that you can do after today that will be very helpful for you. Like I said, it's my very first thing that I give all my sex therapy clients is break up your life into 5-year increments. So between 0 and 5 years old, 5 to 10 years old, all the way to present day, your marriage relationship, or if you're single, where you are today. And sit with yourself with what you know you were exposed to in those early years before you really entered kindergarten. Anything stand out? What do you know about your mom's pregnancy with you and your birth story? What happened in elementary school? When were you exposed to pornography? What did you learn from the public school bus if you attended public school? That's where I got a lot of my sex education, was the middle school bus. And when I did this exercise, I did it in my journal, because that's how I process, as I journal and invite God into sat with myself in those different ages. And when I was in my middle school years, a memory came back to me on the school bus, and these boys were oogling over a half-naked pop star on a CD cover. And the reflection I had was, I don't look like that. So I'm not sexy, I'm not beautiful, I'm not worth oohing over. And then I could see how that carried into my young adult years. So when you do this timeline, you will see the snowball effect. And if you recognize something that is present when you start to notice more, like low desire issues in your marriage or sexual pain, if you notice that later on your timeline, make sure you're doing the work to look for those roots, because they're there. So let's look at the messages from society first that I recognized and that I know we, as especially American women in today's media world, live from and kind of are inundated with. So to be sexy is to be desirable. You need to be sexy to be worthy. If you're not sexual, boys won't want you. It's expected to be sexual in relationships. And, after going through these, an exercise I also have clients do is to pay attention to just how unhealthy the messages are during the TV shows and movies that you watch. And because I start to see wow, they had sex on the first date. How common is that? And so again, it's expected. You'll be rejected if you say no to sex. If you dress conservatively, you're a prude. If you choose to not be sexual before marriage, your boyfriends will be disappointed. Your sexiness is the most important part about you as a woman. So remember, shame is the deep fear of not being worthy of love or relationship with others or with God. And in society's eyes, the message we get is that our worth is rooted in our desirability in sex and how much we give it, really. So unfortunately, to be a Christian woman who lives by biblical sexual integrity is shamed and looked down upon when it comes to these, because this is the standard. So now, what does purity culture in church say? To be sexy is to be sinful, dirty, bad, shameful. Unless you're married, then you can be sexy, but only in the marital bedroom. I literally heard a client say that to me a few months ago when she was referring to messages she got from church. If you're sexual, you'll be impure and boys won't want you. It's your responsibility to make sure boys don't lust, don't show skin. If you're sexual before marriage, you're a disappointment. Your sexual purity is the most important part about you as a Christian woman. Ruth mentioned some metaphors with the paper and the glue. The other one, and I forgot about that one, I've heard the stories of, the flower being passed around the classroom, and by the time it reaches, the last person, all the petals are wilted. It doesn't really look like a flower anymore. That's you if you have sex with other people besides your husband. Or the chewed up piece of gum. One person is all it takes. And then who would want that? These are the metaphors, the images that women have been shown in their church classes growing up. What message does that send? Do you recognize just how much that's impacted you? So again, look at your sexual story. Pay attention. So from church, the fear that was instilled in us not only made us afraid of not not being worthy to a future Christian husband, you know, if we were sexual, but also not worthy in God's eyes. Somehow we are disappointing God with our sexuality. Okay, so now let's look at the messages for Christian women, the ones that in particular we will be reviewing and addressing. Okay, your husband needs sex every 72 hours. So if you don't have sex with him, you're failing as a wife. I don't know if you guys have heard the 72 hours, but I've had people tell me that that's what churches have taught them in their marital classes. The Bible says to be submissive to your husband, which means if he wants sex, you must give him sex. You're not to ever tell him no. If you were sexually pure before marriage, your sex life would be wonderful and blessed with your husband. And if it isn't, there must be something wrong with you. If you are sexually satisfying your husband, he won't struggle with pornography or lust. Sex is the most important aspect of marriage, but we don't talk about it. Yeah, so how many of you have heard even some iteration of the following, or even just believed it on some level? Like, sex is for the man. Or sex hurts. Or you're not going to enjoy sex. You know, I've had peers tell me that the messages they've heard from their mothers is pretty much grin and bear it. Because you're not going to enjoy it, it's for him. Or don't say no to sex, because then he'll be like a hungry person going to the grocery store. He's going to go and find satisfaction elsewhere. Even if you haven't heard that on some level, some of us believe it and are afraid of it. So with those messages, we have been instilled to be suspicious of our husband's sex drives, believing that their sexual desire is pornography or even lust-driven. And with that, with that fear, I think it's in the Great Sex Rescue book, the author uses the metaphor of, it's like there's a metaphorical gun to your marriage if you don't have sex. If you don't have sex, all these bad things will then happen. A lot of fear-based messages. But perfect love drives out fear, so obviously something's off. I want to believe the church was well-meaning. Wait until marriage. Yes, absolutely. I believe that's God's intent and heart for his best for our sexual relationship. And there's good reason for that. But when the focus has been on just don't, and then we start to believe because then you won't be worthy, you'll be a disappointment. Again, you'll be like a wilted flower or a chewed up piece of gum that no one wants. That links fear and shame to sex, not a heart of love and purpose. So well-intended or not, from the church and purity culture, the consequences of it can't be overlooked. So let's look at what have been those consequences, specifically when it comes to these negative sexual messages. This is what I've seen in my office. This is what you read in all the books. It's just affirmed from multiple different sources. So the first one, sexual shame, which is the big purpose of why we're all here today. And it's been found that sexual shame and the impacts of that have the same symptoms as sexual trauma, including women being disconnected from their bodies, dissociating during sex or any kind of even physical touch, believing sex is dirty, uncontrollable, or abusive, experiencing shame, disgust, self-hatred, in other words, shame over their sexuality, a deep distrust in their body, a distrust in men, in intimacy, low sexual desire, lack of sexual pleasure, because that results from really only prioritizing the man's pleasure, and unfortunately men are also not taught to focus on our pleasure. It's all about their orgasm. You know, a question I ask clients is, when does sex end? What comes to mind? Well, when he orgasms. For the most part, that's what I hear. But what if it doesn't have to end because of his orgasm? Is that the goal? What are you living in? And then distrust. So we will first look at addressing the negative messages that women have heard regarding their marriage and sexuality, and then we'll go more into how to address those negative messages, specifically when it comes to sexual dysfunction and distrust. So fortunately, there is hope, even if we've been inundated with all those messages that you saw on the screen a couple slides ago. If you aren't living in freedom in your marital bed, what are you living in? Do you believe that is what God wants for you? To have more anxiety and fear than love when it comes to sex and intimacy, or even just your sexuality? What does grace and truth and love sound like when it comes to your sexual story, and what to believe about what God wants for your sex life? Because the enemy manipulates God's word and truth. You know, a lot of the things that we're taught from purity culture, they're grounded in scripture on some level, because the best lie is a partial truth. Just like in Genesis, you know, when the serpent was tempting Eve, did God really say? He used, you know, the serpent used some of what God said, but not all of it. He added to it. Our sexuality is such a powerful part of who we are, our core sense of self, and how we really live and have our being, which is why the enemy tries to manipulate our beliefs about our sexuality. That's why porn addiction is so rampant. That's why sexual abuse is so terrible. Because it has such a deep impact on us, on women, and really on our relationships, and our sense of self, and everything in between. So we will be using grace and truth to redeem your sexual story. We'll look at what does grace sound like first when it comes to really your husband. Because I'm not here to get you to come home and say, you do all these things to me and you're so terrible and how dare you X, Y, Z. Because your husbands are also victims of this culture. And so I want us to come out with wanting more connection, right? What is the fruit? More connection. And if there's anyone to be angry at, be angry with the poor church teachings and the purity culture and just the lack of courage from pastors. So, like I had said a moment ago, the enemy doesn't want you to hear these things. So I want you to pay attention to your bodies as you are seeing the messages on the screen, hearing the words that I'm saying, because there will be a part of you, potentially, that will be resistant to some of the things that I share. And I want you to pay attention to where that resistance, just the fact that resistance is coming up, what parts of what I'm sharing are you resistant to believe or take on? And just allow yourself the kindness to recognize that your sexual story is all being addressed in this room right now, and it's hard stuff. If it were easy and something that was on our consciousness, probably wouldn't be here because it would have been addressed already. And also engage with the content. My understanding is that you'll be emailed the slides, so I don't want you to worry too much about copying everything down that's on the screen, but more just engage and pay attention to what is it that you didn't know? What is it that surprises you? What are your aha moments from what you're hearing or seeing? What do you struggle to believe? Where does your body resist in what I'm sharing? And then what do you want to explore more of? What do you need more clarity about? So before we move forward, I'm just going to give you the biblical grounding for my approach to addressing these messages and my heart behind them. So in John 1, the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. And then 1:17, for the law was given through Moses, grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. I'm going to say a prayer, because this is important. I don't have the expectation of life change today. That happens, awesome, but the goal is planting seeds. So Lord, soften our hearts, open these women's minds, protect them against any of the enemy's deception that may come in, believing that they're an exception to what I'm sharing. That your grace and truth and love covers all of their sexual struggle, their sexual past, that you want freedom for them in their sexuality. You have come to set the captives free, unbind their shackles that may be impacting their marriage, how they view themselves as women, as created in your image, as your beloved daughter. Be with us as we move forward in this talk today, Lord. Be with them as they leave this building today. Just continue to work in their hearts. Let us feel your presence and experience your grace and truth and love, Lord. I know that I may fumble in my words, but Lord, you will make a way. We trust you, Lord, and we thank you. Amen. Okay. So the message, you are only to be sexy in the privacy of your marital bedroom. Otherwise, you are guilty of causing other men to lust. Grace towards men. We as women are to steward our sexuality well. However, the truth is that you are not responsible for the choices and behaviors of men. Both males and females are responsible for self-control, which is a fruit of the Spirit. However, we were taught as young women to be sexual gatekeepers in our dating relationships because men can't control their impulses. We have to control it for them and have those boundaries. And therefore, we've, on some level, some of us may have repressed our beauty, our sexiness. to protect and make it so we don't have to uphold boundaries as often. Maybe if we're not as desirable, we won't have to face saying no, and then the result that may come from that. There isn't anything wrong with being sexy, but we did internalize that it's wrong because of the impact our bodies do have on men. You know, like visual cues are very important. You know, again, I heard one woman say earlier, that's why there's lingerie. You know, because our husbands are visual, and when we show our breasts or any kind of skin, or even just wear something that shows our curves, you know, our innate female beauty and sexiness, men will likely find us attractive. But them finding us attractive and appreciating our God-given beauty, because we all have that, is different than lust. Lust is the choice to objectify. But we can't miss that our female sexuality is indeed powerful. Why else would men pay for sex? And to be Christ-like as women, we are to use that power of our sexuality, of our femininity, our beauty, responsibly and with kindness towards men. So, looking at your heart, you know, asking yourself, am I purposely doing something or dressing in a certain way to get a reaction from a man? Am I trying to manipulate in some way? Am I carrying myself in a seductive way that the end result is objectification? Am I dressing for attention, for approval, for power? Men are responsible for their choices. They make the choice to objectify, to lust. They make the choice to take advantage, to assault. But we can't be naive. You know, grace towards men is stewarding our sexuality well and honoring God in our God-given sexuality and beauty. So along a similar vein, next message, if your husband struggles with pornography or lust, it's because you're not having enough sex with him. So grace towards our husbands. Men, like anyone, want to feel desired and wanted, and sexual intimacy is a surefire way for men to feel desired by their wives. However, again, you are not responsible for the choices and behaviors of your husband. Because just, you know, as women, sexual intimacy helps us feel wanted and desired by our husbands, and your husband feels the same way about sexual intimacy with you. And pornography is a surefire way for men to feel adequate, which is a big insecurity and that men in particular have. And it's a surefire way for them to feel desired, because as one of my mentors always says, the women in porn always have affirming faces. Porn is appealing to men, to our husbands potentially, because when men feel rejected, when their sexual advances are rejected, they don't experience it as you just saying no to sex, you're saying no to him. You're rejecting him. You know, I've heard that from a lot of males. He wants to feel like he's a priority, that you think about him, that you want him, and sex helps him believe that. However, your husband is responsible to make sure his need for affirmation is separated from sex. You know, you can know and have an idea if he needs sex to be affirmed in his masculinity if sex is a demand in your marriage. And it's his responsibility to address that. So 1 Thessalonians 4, 3 through 5. It is God's will that you should be sanctified, that you should avoid sexual immorality, that each of you should learn to control your own body in a way that is holy and honorable, not in passionate lust. That each of you should learn to control your own body. You are not responsible for your husband's sexual desire and what he does with it if it's not satiated by you. So one author put it this way: when we are taught that men will be tempted to lust or have an affair, going back to the gun, women can feel as if they're having sex with a metaphorical gun to their marriage. You are responsible for your own body, just as he is responsible for his, in his own sexual desire and what he does with it. There's so much more we can say on this, really all of these, but for the sake of time, I have to move on, unfortunately. Just a primer. So the next message: your husband needs sex. Why does sex feel like a need, especially for men? Well, grace towards them is realizing that the surge of testosterone in men's bodies can be a very powerful bodily experience. To give you some perspective, the average testosterone levels for males is 300 to 1,000 nanograms per deciliter. So when men get their testosterone checked and it's below 300, that's considered low testosterone. So the average for males is 300 to 1,000, whereas for women, our average throughout our lifetime ranges from 8 to 75. And 75 is when we're like 18 years old. And our testosterone levels decrease to about half by the time we hit menopause. So our highest throughout our life, on average, 75. Men's lowest, 300. It feels different for them. Their desires in their bodies, whereas our sexual desire, for the most part, is more mental and emotional. It's in our thought and our fantasy life. We don't really typically feel sexual all the time first, like men do. It comes from, what are we thinking about? Sometimes hormones have a role in that, but it's not any way near what men experience. So the truth is that sex and ejaculation is not a need. Human beings do not need sex like food or water or even shelter. If we did, it would be on Maslow's hierarchy of needs, that you've learned about in school, I'm sure. It would have sex, water, shelter, orgasm. Or sex, water, shelter, ejaculation for a male. But it doesn't say that, does it? Because sex is not a need in that way. My clients always get a kick when I say this, but I affirm them. Ladies, your husband's penis will not fall off. I've worked with a woman and she brought up blue balls and didn't really know what that was. But she didn't like to undress in front of her husband, and one of those reasons was she didn't want him to get aroused when she knows that she doesn't want to have sex, because then he'll experience blue balls and then she'll feel guilty. It's like, one, that doesn't happen that often, and two, mild discomfort. It's not a need. Nothing is going to explode. So when it comes to that 72-hour rule, men need sex every 72 hours, or make sure you have sex with your husband every 72 hours. From what I've read, from what I've heard, there's no grounding in that. My guesstimation is that it likely came from a man who wanted to guarantee that he'd have sex at least a couple times a week. And there you go. There are other avenues your husband can use to dispel his testosterone energy. What we can do with our sexual desire, our sexual drive. Your husband can work out, he can exercise, he can run, he can mow the lawn, he can do other things. It's like that's a lot of what helps them work out is their testosterone, that energy that they get. He doesn't need to ejaculate. And then when it comes to the failure piece, if you don't have sex with him, if you don't have sex with him on a regular basis, you're a failure. But your identity and worth as a woman or a wife is not in your sexual frequency with your husband. Okay, so you must be submissive to your husband's desire for sex. Grace towards our husbands. Kindness for your husband is remembering that he is a sexual being just as you are. Ladies, you are the only one who can participate in your husband's sexual desire, just as he's the only one who can participate in yours. We are sexual beings. It is unkind to not have sexual intimacy and to participate in that part of who we are. Again, God created sex for a reason, for marriage. So if anything, be kind. Because a sexless marriage is based on whether a couple is having sex less than once a month, less than 10 times a year. You are in a sexless marriage if you have sex less than once a month. So let's look at where this stance of submission comes from. Ephesians 5. So in Ephesians 5:21 through 24. Submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. Wives, submit yourselves to your own husbands as you do to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is the head of the church, his body, of which he is the Savior. Now, as the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit to their husbands in everything. Man, the church really is everything, like, to men's advantage, huh? But what's the truth? Well, what's the very next verse? Ephesians 5:25. Husbands, love your wives, just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. Isn't it love and loving for your husband to give up his own sexual gratification if it isn't life-giving to you? If you don't feel loved in it? If it's associated with pain and anxiety and hurt? I think that's what Jesus would do. Right? He wouldn't say, submit. He'd look at, what is love? Do you feel 5:28 through 29, husbands ought to love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. After all, no one ever hated their own body, but they feed and care for their body, just as Christ does the church. How is your husband caring for your body? Is he caring for your body if he forces sex? Is he caring for your heart if you have sex with him but you feel more disconnected afterward than you did before? Do you feel like you're just a vessel for his sexual gratification? So the context of that first verse in 5:21 starts out with talking about submission in the context of reverence for Christ. Reverence means to be treated with deep respect and awe. Is your husband respecting the heart of Jesus and God's intent with how he treats you sexually? Submit to each other out of reverence for Christ. Is he respecting the heart of Jesus with how he treats you sexually? Because submission can be based on fear or trust. And women trust their husbands when they know that they are loved, like Jesus loves them, like Christ loves the church. Are you submitting out of fear because you feel like you're obligated? Because you feel like you'd be a failure or going against that verse or any kind of pastoral teaching if you don't just give in? But submission out of love, what can that look like? That can look like saying yes to your husband's request for sex, even if the circumstances aren't perfect. So when you're tired and you have a headache, because deciding to have sex with your husband is different than duty and obligation or a fear-based submission. So something to think about is, what is the fruit of saying yes to sex when you don't have sexual desire in that moment? After you engage in sexual intimacy, is there more connection or disconnection in your marriage? Or do you have feelings of being used? Are you resentful? Because saying yes, even when you're not desiring sex, can still produce life-giving connection. So that goes to the next one. You must not ever tell your husband no to sex. Grace, really for both of you, is the fact that your husband wants you to want to have sex with him. The biggest turn on for a man is a turned on wife. If he knew how miserable you were, and he's the kind, loving man that I'm sure he is, he will not want you to continue. And if you don't have desire for sex, again, you can still decide to say yes from a neutral place. But with the truth, your yes is only as meaningful if you have the freedom to say no. Again, if you believe you can say no, and it's not associated with like guilt or feeling like a failure or disappointment or a bad Christian wife. So if you don't feel like you can say no, if you feel obligated to submit to your husband's desire for sex, then you're engaging in duty sex. And that's not fun for you, and if your husband knew it, it would definitely not be fun for him. Now, probably on some level he knows. He knows if you're engaged or not, and if you're enjoying yourself. So where does this duty belief come from? 1 Corinthians 7, 2 through 5. Since sexual immorality is occurring, each man should have sexual relations with his own wife and each woman with her own husband. The husband should fulfill his marital duty to his wife, and likewise the wife to her husband. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but yields it to her husband. In the same way, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but yields it to his wife. Do not deprive each other, except perhaps by mutual consent and for a time, so that you may devote yourselves to prayer. I don't know if you heard that, but your husband is also to yield his body over to you for your sexual enjoyment as well. And again, if you're not enjoying it, if it's not life-giving, then is your husband honoring God's heart in your sexual relationship? Remembering that kindness is that you are the only one who can participate in your husband's sexual desire. God created us as sexual beings, and it's kind to not deprive that part of your spouse if you can help it. Someone talks about you must not deprive, but do not deprive is not the same as never say no, right? Or my husband gets to have whatever he wants when it comes to sex. Because just as, if your child comes to you and wants to eat some chips before dinner, and you say no, you're not depriving your kid of food. Because you're not saying no always. And kindness is also reframing your no so that your husband doesn't feel rejected. So instead of saying no, say, maybe give a different time or day when you will. So sexual purity before marriage leads to a blissful sex life with your husband. Grace, for both of you, is the fact that marital sexual intimacy takes work regardless of experience. And the truth, God does not reward or punish us based on our purity. Marital sexual intimacy takes work. Survey has shown that the best sex that couples report to have are those who've been married over 25 years. Because good sex is dependent on communication, trust, vulnerability. Yes. And vulnerability, which grows as you grow with your spouse over time. God will not punish you based on your purity or lack thereof. Because fear has to do with punishment. Remember John 4:18. Perfect love drives out fear. And let's not forget that Jesus loved women with sexual sin. You have the woman at the well, John 4. The woman brought for stoning in John 8. He loved them well. Sex is the most important aspect of marriage. Grace for both of you. God designed sexual intimacy as a sacred part of marriage. And really, God is the most important aspect of marriage. So a question that I've wrestled with as I've done this talk and just in life in general, something that we may not really think about too often is, why does sex matter? I know people make a big deal out of it, but why? What words do I put to why it matters? So I'm really grateful for Ruth's talk last night, because she told us why it matters, within the context of marriage. Oneness, protection against any kind of temptation, for comfort, and for knowing each other, knowing your husband the way that God longs to know you. Because sex is meant to point to God. It was created as a way, I believe, to make the invisible is Tina Sellers. She says, God desires for there to be no walls between him and his people. Just as in lovemaking, partners become lost in each other, the human image used to remind us of God's deep love is that of two lovers, fully embodied, fully in love, and filled with passion and desire, together making and creating love. Another author likened making love to Holy Communion. So just as we take the bread and the wine to remember and renew our covenant with Jesus, when we make love with our husbands, we are renewing the vows we made on our wedding day. We worship with our bodies, Romans 12:1. So when we engage in sex, we want to look at who is being worshipped in spirit by this act, God or the enemy. And the enemy comes to steal, kill, and destroy the sexual story that God longs for you. So now we're going to move into sexual dysfunction. Fortunately, a lot of this is going to be, because we're looking at sexual dysfunction when it comes to when it's a result of these negative messages. So not other areas. I'm looking at purely when it's an impact of negative sexual beliefs and anxiety. So sexual pain and vaginismus. So this is in particular sexual pain that's caused by the tightening of the pelvic floor muscles, which we learned about earlier. And vaginismus is the extreme version of that, in which penetration is nearly impossible. And some husbands describe it as their penis hitting up against a brick wall when their wives have vaginismus. So vaginismus, from the sex therapy lens, occurs when negative beliefs and feelings have been paired with the act or idea of vaginal penetration. So to address sexual pain and vaginismus, it's important to rewrite the negative sexual messages that you've come to believe, as well as becoming empowered in your body. And empowerment in your body is believing that you are worthy of sexual pleasure. It's knowing that you are willingly making a choice to be intimate with your husband, and that you're not at his disposal just solely for sexual gratification. Again, going back to 1 Corinthians 7:4, it's your body that you have the power then to yield to your husband. You can't yield something if it's not first yours. Sexual pain and the tightening of muscles occurs also, a lot of the times from anxiety. And if we have those negative beliefs, believing that we are somehow not good enough, going to be punished, disappointment, this is bad, the things that we have internalized and hold on to so deeply and so hard from purity culture when we're single, that doesn't just go away when you're married. And so with that, it makes sense that your body closes up to try to protect itself from experiencing that shame, from having sex. So low sexual desire. It's important to explore the negative beliefs that interfere with emotional connection with your husband. Like, do you trust him? Do you believe that he is for you? Because you won't desire sex if you struggle to believe that sex is for you as well. And if you struggle to believe, trust in your husband's fidelity, that you aren't just there for his sexual gratification, you're not just a vagina. As Dr. Doug Rosenau says, he makes sure men know this is your wife's vagina. It's personal. Sex is personal. Do we trust that? So pay attention to your mindset during and about sex. And look at, when it comes to looking at your sexual story, when has sexual desire been for you and about you? Because if you keep putting other people's needs ahead of your own, then sex will just be another area of demand. And of course, you won't have desire, because your cup needs to be filled too. So if you struggle with lack of pleasure or arousal, look at your beliefs about your right to sexual pleasure. Because the clitoris has 8,000 nerve endings and is strictly for female sexual pleasure. There's no procreative purpose, and it actually has twice as many nerve endings as your husband's penis. And if you believe that sex is for the man, then that may lead to a lack of foreplay. Because it's important that we had enough foreplay as women to get aroused and be lubricated. And that can decrease our pleasure during sex. So lack of trust and intimacy leads to a lack of open sexual communication. So again, going back to couples who've been married the longest report the best sex. Because there's trust and they can communicate more vulnerably and openly. So finally, distrust. How is your sexual shame impacting your openness with your husband? Do you trust your husband to not violate you? Because if on some level you believe sex is a violation, then you're going to close up in vaginismus. Do you trust your husband is for your pleasure, that he wants you to enjoy sex as much as he does? And if you believe your husband is lusting after other women or viewing pornography because you haven't been sexual in a little while, that will cause distrust and disfidelity. So when you put language, again, to, is my husband trustworthy? Then you can consciously start to combat what the enemy wants you to believe, which is you can't trust men or you can't trust your husband. You can't trust his desire for you. So to wrap up, again, I'm really big on we reap what we sow and looking at the fruit, because it's a very biblical concept. Galatians 5:22 through 23, looking at the fruit of the Spirit. Does your sexual relationship have the fruit of joy and love and peace? Is it forbearing? And forbearance means restraint. It means patience, ladies. Is your husband patient? Is he restraining with you? Is it kind? Is it good? Is it faithful? Is there fidelity? Is your husband gentle? Is there self-control in your sexual relationship? Because this is the story the Lord wants for your sexuality, is for it to be full of all of that. So how does your sexual expression in your marriage look when it's rooted in love and not fear? Rooted in forbearance and not force. Kindness and not duty. This is God's heart for your sexuality. Pay attention to the fruit. Because the seeds of the fruit were planted within your sexual story. What is the fruit of your current sexual relationship? If it doesn't look like that, then do some work. Because your marriage, your sex life, your husband, you are worth it. You are worth that. Here's some resources. Several of those are also on the resource list that you guys were given. One I would add is Sex, God, and the Conservative Church by Tina Sellers. It's directed specifically towards therapists, but not that you guys can't also read it. So it's also a good resource. And then if for some reason you don't get these slides, I have my contact information, my email address. Just reach out to me. I'll send you the PDF of these slides, and also the ones from my talks, my breakout sessions. And, this stuff is really important. Unfortunately, there are very, very few sex therapists, and let alone sex therapists from the Christian worldview, to address specifically purity culture. So, if you want to have more conversations, and if you notice that the fruit of your marital relationship is not Galatians, then please reach out. My cards are back there. Okay. I think we're doing Q&A now.
Okay, we'll just use the other one.
Is that better? Okay. Hey, that works. Can you hear me? Thank you so much, Karissa. That was fantastic. It was really wonderful and powerful to see those lies up there on the screen, and then to see the grace and truth addressed. You said something. You said the enemy does not want us to hear because we are revealing the words we carry on a deep level. You ladies have no idea how hard some of these women have worked to make this event happen, and how hard the enemy has been fighting us. It has been a tooth and nail battle all day. We've been having just issue after issue, technical issues and everything, and so he is fighting hard. And so that really resounded because it's true. He's been fighting. He didn't want this to happen. He didn't want us to hear these things. Felicia Masenheimer of Every Woman Theologian says, the enemy of our sexuality is also the enemy of our souls. And he claimed the area of sexuality, sex and sexuality long ago. And it's time we, as God's children, reclaim it. It's time we tell the enemy that he no longer has the power over our sex and sexuality. It's time we stand up and say, you can't have my marriage, you can't have my kids, you can't have my sexuality, this is ours. We're taking this back, and that's what we're here to do. The conversations that we have started this weekend, that's the whole point, was to take back this area, reclaim the ground, as God designed it. So big thank you to Karissa for that today. At this time, I'm going to go ahead and have our speakers come up. We're going to do our Q&A. During the registration process, you guys submitted some questions anonymously. We're going to read those questions and answer as many as we can. Why don't we bring the bar stools down here? That might be a little bit better. We're just going to grab those. We heard from Ruth last night, we heard from Karissa today, and then our third speaker that's going to be up here. Some of you ladies would prefer in a breakout session. This is Sue Verbal. She is a licensed counselor and specializes in emotionally focused therapy and communication. So she's going to help us here. And I'm going to have it pulled up. So we have one mic that works, so I'm just going to pass it to whoever's going to be answering the question. And sorry, bear with me. We lost the live stream again.